To give the background, we're going to start in John chapter 5, verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews. That's the unnamed feast that we've talked about many times today. And Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. And Bethesda, by most scholars and archaeologists today, they identify it as a place in the western part of the old city, in what today is the Muslim quarter, called the Church of St. Anne. There's an ancient pool there, and they say that is the Church of Bethesda. Hebrew was probably, or Aramaic, something like Beit Chista, the house of righteousness, although there is a textual variant in the Greek where it might be Beit Zeta, the house of olive. So it's unclear exactly where this pool is, but if you read it in the New Testament text, it's quite clear that this is the pool of Siloam. We actually hear of a replica of the pool of Siloam or Shiloach, which is the pool in Jerusalem where the water would flow out from the major spring of Jerusalem, the Gihon spring. It would flow through Hezekiah's tunnel, through an S-shaped tunnel that King Hezekiah had dug during the time of the Assyrian invasion, and the water was diverted to the pool of Siloam, or in Hebrew, the pool of Shiloach. Shiloach means the sent one. And it was called Brechat Shiloach, the pool of the sent one, because the waters were sent forth from the Gihon spring through this tunnel into the city where the water source could be more readily defended. Why do I say it's the pool of Siloam? So when we read on in John chapter 5, verse 3, in these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered. And then the next part is in brackets. I put it in brackets. In the King James, it's not in brackets. The next part does not appear in many manuscripts. So they were waiting for the moving of the water, for an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first after the troubling of the water stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. And a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. Now you read this passage here, and you read about something that we don't find anywhere else in the New Testament, and certainly not in the Tanakh. And you put it really, I like the way you put it, John.
Well, if this text is accurate, I mean, it teaches a message that's foreign to the rest of the Bible, and that is, whoever gets up the fastest, knocks everybody else down, and gets to the water, receives salvation.
Right, I got this image of George Costanza, and there's a fire, and he's like knocking down the old lady, get out of my way, get out of my way. The first one to get there gets saved. Now, many manuscripts don't have this, I think for another reason as well. It's describing something which is really an alien concept, that there's some angel that comes down and messes with the water, and that causes people to be healed. It's a bizarre concept. So if you look in most translations, for example, NRSV, there is no John 5, verse 4. Doesn't exist in John. And the second half of verse 3 isn't there either. In your NRSV, in your, I believe it's the NIV, it's missing as well as one of the translations. And what's interesting is, we look in the manuscripts, and what do we find? We find our good friend, the obelisk. John 5, it's not John 6 anymore, it's John 5, the second half of verse 3, 3b, and verse 4, in Majuscule 41, St. Petersburg Russian National Library, Greek 34, from the 9th century, has the obelisk in the margin telling you, I don't trust this verse, this ain't supposed to be there. Right there you see the obelisk marking all of John, second half of verse 3 and all of verse 4. Here's another, and John found a whole bunch of these manuscripts. I only brought up 2 of them because we're way out of time. Minuscule 348 is a much later one. This one's from the year 1022. This is roughly the same time as many of the manuscripts we looked at. From Milan, Biblioteca Ambrosiana, John 5:4 is marked with obelisks in the margin. You can see them up there in the upper right. Those are obelisks saying, hey, this is a doubtful verse. And why is it a doubtful verse? Because it doesn't, and some manuscripts don't have it at all, right? But I'm bringing you the ones with the obelisk to show you this isn't just John 6:4 that's unique with the obelisk. This is something that scribes in the Middle Ages would see certain verses and say, that's not supposed to be there. We're going to obelize that verse. John 5, 6 through 8 continues. When Yeshua saw him lying there, this is the man who for 38 years had been a paralytic, and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, do you want to get well? Sir, the invalid replied, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. So nothing here about an angel, but there is something about the waters being stirred. And I immediately know what body of water that is in Jerusalem based on this statement. It can only be the pool of Siloam, the pool of the sent one. And why do I say that? So the pool of Siloam, and let's finish it. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. It doesn't imply that the first one down gets healed, though, right? He never gets down. Then Yeshua said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Shabbat. And so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Shabbat. It is a Shabbat. The law forbids you to carry your mat." Now, before we get to what this whole thing of the mat on Shabbat is, let's talk about the pool of Siloam. So the pool of Siloam, or the pool of the sent one, was this pool in Jerusalem, and it was fed by the Gihon spring. And the Gihon spring is a special type of spring. It's what's called a rhythmic spring. And a rhythmic spring is a type of spring that in a cycle will gush out water from deep in the aquifer. Let's back up. What is a spring in the first place? So a well is where you dig down to the aquifer. A spring is where there's a fissure in the earth and the water under pressure pushes out from an underground lake called the aquifer. So Israel is a land that is dependent upon natural springs. We have some wells, but primarily, especially in the mountains, if there's no spring there, there's no settlement, right? Go to anywhere where there was an ancient town, somewhere around there is a spring. The spring water oozes out from the aquifer, but in a rhythmic spring, it oozes out in a cycle. And the reason it does this, they believe, is that there's some sort of underground cave, and the cave fills with water. When it reaches a certain height, the water pours over, and then it's pushed out through the rhythmic spring. There's a wonderful rhythmic spring just outside Jerusalem, which I absolutely love, partly because my sister lives there, and so I've been there many, many times. It's called En Mabua, meaning the bubbling spring. And you go there, and you're standing in this pool of water, and it's completely dry. It's an empty pool of water. You see that the bottom is a little bit wet, right? But the water doesn't even cover your ankles. And you stand there for 40 minutes, and you're underwater. And it's a cycle of about every 40 minutes, the water fills up, stays up for a while, and then slowly drains out, fills up, and drains out. And when it comes up fast, right? It can come up within less than 5 minutes, and you're covered in water. That's fast when you're standing there thinking, if you've had a nap there, you're in trouble, right? So this is called a rhythmic spring, also called a siphon spring, because the phenomenon that happens is called a siphon. So there's 4 rhythmic springs in Israel. In the whole world, there's approximately 100 of these, and 4 of them are in Israel. One of them is in northern Israel. It's called En El Jin, which is the Arabic name, and it means the spring of the jinn. And that's like the word genie, right? So the spring of the demon or the angel. Sound familiar? So there were superstitions around these springs because they didn't know why the water would gush out every 40 minutes, or in the case of the Gihon, 3 times a day, the water would come gushing out. They didn't know why it would come out suddenly, and the rest of the time it was just slowly coming out. So the belief of the common folk at the time was that there was a spirit that lived in the spring, and the spirit would rouse up the water, it would stir and trouble up the water. So how did it happen that this superstition found its way into the Gospel of John? Well, people were copying this over the generations. Someone must have been copying it in Jerusalem and said, "Oh, I know why the waters are troubled, because an angel comes and stirs them." And he probably first wrote that in the margin. The next guy who copied it, it wasn't in the margin anymore. It makes its way into the body of the text. This is how these things happen. Thankfully, some scribes realized this and marked it with the obelisk, just like John 6:4. Other scribes left it out altogether because they didn't have it in their source, just like John 6:4. So this verse and a half was added by superstitious people. But there's no question whatsoever, in my mind at least, that this is talking about the Gihon spring, which then feeds the pool of Siloam, and the pool with the 5 porticos that the man was standing in front of, or I guess he wasn't standing because he was a paralytic. The one that he was lying on his mat in front of, that was the pool of Siloam based on the geography and based on what it says, not in verses 3 and 4, because that was added, but based on what it explicitly says in verse 7, that he says when the water is stirred because of the cycle of the rhythmic spring, it was 3 times a day in Jerusalem. I'm not the first one to discover this. This is the site that everyone believed was the site of the healing of the paralytic before the 20th century. If you would have asked anybody 200 years ago, when you went to Jerusalem, where did this happen? They pointed you to the Gihon Spring. And it's only later that they shifted it in 1905 to the Church of St. Anne.